Greetings and welcome to Conversations at Noon on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. I'm Tammy Denise. In 1995, the General Assembly established the Connecticut Freedom Trail to acknowledge the struggle and freedom within the Black and African American communities. There are designated sites such as museums, ancient burying grounds, private homes, and other things. They are lined under sites of consciousness, Underground Railroad, the Amistad, anti-slavery, and abolition. Today, we will be joined by Dr. Jesse Nasta. He will speak to us about the Battleground for Freedom in Middletown's Beman Triangle, the Leverett Beman Historic District in Connecticut Abolitionism, 1823 to 1865. Before we get to Professor Nasta, please remember to do our survey. Let us know what other programs you would like to see, as well as if you have any questions, please put them into the chat, and I will make sure to get to as many as we possibly can. Today, we will be joined by our guest speaker, Jesse Nasta. He is the executive director of the Middlesex County Historical Society in Middletown, and he is going to bring to us this exciting story about Leverett Beman Triangle. Jesse, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. So to begin, thank you for that introduction. My name is Jesse Nasta, and I'll just tell you a little bit about how I came to study the Leverett Beman Historic District, the Beman Triangle. I came back to Middletown to teach at Wesleyan University in 2017 in Wesleyan's African American Studies department, but I had actually am from Middletown. I actually grew up a couple blocks from the Beman Triangle. And when I was growing up there in the 90s, there really wasn't an awareness of the amazing African American history of the Beman Triangle. The Cross Street AME Zion Church was still in the Triangle, so of course the congregation knew about the Beamans and knew about their church's history. But it's really only in the past 2 decades that there's been this growing awareness of the Beman Triangle and its significance. So to put this in broader perspective, I want to speak a little bit about the Connecticut Freedom Trail itself. The Connecticut Freedom Trail is a network of over 130 sites throughout the state of Connecticut in over 50 towns, which is really unique and remarkable. These 130 plus sites all document some element of African American history and African American struggles for freedom and equality in Connecticut, sometime between the 1600s and today. And it really, Connecticut's unique in having such an extensive developed networks of historic sites that are being recognized for their African American history. So one thing I want to do in my talk today is explain why the Leverett Beman Historic District, nicknamed the Beman Triangle, is on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, why it's important to Connecticut history and Connecticut African American history, but then also talk about the ways in which the Beman Triangle is connected to many of the other sites throughout the Freedom Trail, that the Leverett Beman Historic District and the free African American community there were very much hooked into other free Black communities throughout the state of Connecticut and far beyond, fighting for anti-slavery, fighting for equal rights, and how the Leverett Beman Historic District tells that story of those interconnections. So let me, I'd like to start with my slides, please. Excellent. So to orient you, if you're not familiar with Middletown, Connecticut, this is a recent photo I took of part of the Beman Triangle. Those houses are on what's now Vine Street, and that pink house you're looking at and the one to the left and the right, those are some of the oldest African American homes in the state. They date back to the 1840s and 1850s, well before the Civil War. And in the background behind those houses, you'll see Indian Hill Cemetery for those who are familiar. So the Leverett Beman Historic District is now owned almost entirely by Wesleyan University as part of the campus. And to give you a bird's eye view, free African Americans began buying property in what's now the Beman Triangle and developing it as a free neighborhood centered around the AME Zion Church there, the Cross Street AME Zion Church, in the 1820s. And this neighborhood persisted as an African American homeowning community into the 1920s. And a couple African American homeowners were still there in the 1930s. So a little over a century. After the 1930s, for various reasons that I'll get into, this neighborhood became all white, mostly Polish immigrants, Italian immigrants. And then around the 1970s and 80s, Wesleyan purchased these homes for campus use, along with many other homes in the surrounding blocks. So you had a 1 century long history as an African American neighborhood. Then in the early 20th century, it was a white working class neighborhood for about 3 decades. And then it was at that point in the 70s and 80s that Wesleyan acquired these historic homes. One thing I will say is that a team of us at the Middlesex County Historical Society are currently working to get the Leverett Beman Historic District on the National Register of Historic Places. And Wesleyan, the property owner, has given permission for this. And this is important for recognition and protection of the neighborhood. And also, I'll be talking about the ways in which the Beman Triangle is comparable to some other free Black communities throughout Connecticut that date back to the early 1800s. Little Liberia in Bridgeport, for example, Jail Hill in Norwich, Hempstead District in New London. All of those neighborhoods I mentioned are already on the National Register of Historic Places. So in a lot of ways, Middletown is it's time to get this recognition for the Beman Triangle. So let me back up to the 19th century. This is a map of the 130 plus sites on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, the Leverett Beman Historic District being one of those 130 plus sites on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. So this happens to be my background, but it's also my slide here. This is a map of the neighborhood in 1874 from an atlas published by the Beers Company of Middlesex County. So to orient you, it's nicknamed the Beman Triangle because, as you can see, it's a 5-acre triangle of land bounded by Park Street, which is now Vine Street, which is now Knowles Avenue, and then Cross Street. And as you can see, Indian Hill Cemetery is directly to the left there, and Wesleyan's campus is directly to the right. And here, that green triangle is the original site of the Cross Street AME Zion Church, which will be celebrating its bicentennial this coming year, its 200th year anniversary. So one thing that's very significant about this triangle here is that by 1874, all 10 houses you see there, all 10 parcels were owned by African American families. So this was an exclusively home-owning, exclusively African American neighborhood. And the map doesn't indicate race, but all these families, L.C. Beeman, Dingle, Truitt, were all African American. So as I said, one of my goals today is to talk about the history of the Leverett Beman Historic District and Middletown, but also ways in which this neighborhood was connected to dozens of sites throughout Connecticut, dozens of free Black communities throughout Connecticut that are also represented on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. So I'm going to focus on 4 aspects of free Black activism that were central to the development of the Beman Triangle, and in which the Beamans were central actors, and then think about the ways that those actions connected them to other free Black communities and free Black activist networks. So one of them is the network of free Black churches that existed throughout Connecticut and throughout the North, going back 2 centuries ago, especially the AME, the African Methodist Episcopal, and the AME Zion, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, of which the Cross Street Church is one. I'm also going to talk about the network of temperance, which is anti-alcohol, and abolitionist or anti-slavery societies that free African Americans developed in Middletown, and which connected them to many different sites, many different free African American communities throughout the state. Talk about something that was called at the time, quote, the Colored Convention Movement, of which the Beemans and others from Middletown were leaders, and of course the Underground Railroad. And one thing I want you to keep in mind as I talk about these different aspects is that they were intricately linked, that we can't talk about the history of Black churches without also talking about abolition or the Underground Railroad or the convention movement for equal rights, that they were intertwined. Many of them were physically based in the churches. The Cross Street Church is called the Freedom Church, in fact, for this reason. And a lot of the same activists, a lot of the same community leaders were heads of all of these things. So they would be Underground Railroad agents to aid those escaping from the South, but would also be leaders right here in New England in their communities, their churches, their associations. And I have a quote up here called, quote, living an anti-slavery life, which a historian recently coined this term, which I think's really relevant and really poignant. The idea that before the Civil War, so before 1860, 90% of African Americans in this country were still in the South and were still enslaved. And then of the 10% of African Americans, the 500,000 who lived in the North and were no longer enslaved by the 1830s, those 500,000, as we'll talk about in Connecticut, faced obstacles to enfranchisement. Most were disenfranchised. Most lacked other basic citizenship rights, faced a huge amount of discrimination in employment and housing and education. So essentially, by owning property, by being temperate, not drinking alcohol, by pursuing education, through their way of living, through all of those things, they aim to disprove the logic of slavery, that slavery was somehow natural or all right for people of African descent, which was the prevailing ideology in America at the time. They were proving that that African Americans, could not only be free, but could be self-sufficient, self-governing, self-reliant, respectable, educated. And in fact, they were all of those things. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So in terms of the development of this neighborhood in particular, I want to go back to this map. By the late 1820s, as I said, the first free African Americans were buying property right here. They were the Jeffrey family. So in a lot of ways, we call this the Beman Triangle, but it could also be called the Jeffrey Triangle because they were in fact the first free Black homeowners there. And to connect this site to the Freedom Trail, Asa and George Jeffrey, the father and son, were the first free African Americans to purchase land here in the 1820s. But George's son, who was also named George Jeffrey, after the Civil War, went on to become one of the leaders for African American voting rights and equal rights laws in Connecticut. And his house, where he died in 1906, is in Meriden and is also on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. So the Jeffreys are just one example of how these neighborhoods, these families, and all these sites on the Connecticut Freedom Trail are intimately connected. And in fact, the Jeffreys even were in-laws to the Beeman. So these African-American activist families were tied by neighborhood, by community, by shared activism, and oftentimes even by marriage or blood relationship. And then by 1843, Leverett Beman had bought this parcel from the Jeffreys, and they were both living there by the 1840s. And then there was a third African-American homeowner at what is now 9 Vine Street, the Brooks family, by the mid-1840s. So we'll skip ahead to the mid-1840s. George Jeffrey dies in the mid-1840s, and he leaves a mortgage on what is now the Beman Triangle. So he passes away. He owes hundreds of dollars on a mortgage on this property to the white man he had bought the property from. His widow, who is Leverett Beman's sister-in-law, inherits the property, but also inherits this debt, also inherits the mortgage. So what actually happens in the mid-1840s is Leverett Beman takes on the mortgage from his sister-in-law. He buys the property from her so that it doesn't fall into the hands of the white creditors who held the mortgage. So now Leverett Beman acquires it. And it is at that point in the mid-1840s that he takes the land that had belonged to his sister-in-law and brother-in-law that they were in danger of losing and divides it up into 10 small parcels, about 1/10 of an acre each. And let's fast forward. This is the actual survey map prepared by the city of Middletown for Leverett Beman, showing how those 10 parcels were divided and showing where houses were already standing and where there were no houses. So by 1847, within a year, Leverett Beman begins selling these small parcels to other free African Americans. And that is how this neighborhood came to be an entirely African American owning community. A couple observations. One is that there is sort of a bit of a debate about, was this a quote planned community? Did Leverett Beman, plan this community? And for one thing, I don't think we'll ever prove one way or another exactly. The only documents we have are this map itself. But I think the bigger point, whether it was planned or not, the bigger point is that this was a free Black African American property owning community, that his actions count more than I think whether he thought of it as planned or not planned, if that makes sense. So really, I think the fact that the Jeffreys and then the Beamans managed to purchase this property, acquire it, and then sell it to other free African Americans, whether we want to call that a planned community or a community that happened to come about because Leverett Beman didn't want the holder of the mortgage to reclaim the property, I think is not the most relevant thing. The most relevant thing is what they did and what this community represents. And in terms of what the community represents, for one thing, both Leverett Beman and those he sold the property to were all leaders in the Cross Street AME Zion Church. A lot of them were trustees of the church. So for them, both church leadership, property ownership, independent neighborhoods all represented the promise of freedom in New England. And when I say the promise of freedom, when I talk about the Beman Triangle, a lot of people assume that those who live in the Beman Triangle came here from the South, had somehow, escaped Southern slavery. But in fact, the Bemans, the Jeffreys, and most of the other early residents of the Beman Triangle were the children of those who had been enslaved right here in Connecticut. So really, it's freedom from Northern slavery that provided the immediate context for the development of the Beman Triangle, and the immediate history background for why, those like the Bemans, within one generation, they literally went from being property here in Connecticut, having their bodies owned by an enslaver and sold by enslavers right here in Connecticut, to being able to say that they are both have their free papers and own property, own a home of their own. So again, that leap in one generation from being defined as property to owning property of your own, and the dignity and security that provided, is, I think, the big story of the Beman Triangle, more so whether it was, quote, planned or not. And there was also a huge political significance to property ownership, because at this time, free Black men in Connecticut were explicitly denied the vote. The vote was limited to white men. So by proving that you were a property owner, that you could save money, that you were diligent, that you could save your resources, you were sort of disproving a lot of the logic of white supremacy that said that Black people were incapable of all those things: self-management, discipline, economizing, all of those things. Speaking of the Cross Street AME Zion Church, so as I mentioned, Leverett Beman and those he sold property to were all leaders and early trustees of the Cross Street AME Zion Church. This building on the left was the Cross Street AME Zion Church's building from 1867 until the late 1970s, and then on the right, the newer church was built in the 1981 and was used until 2007, when Wesleyan purchased that property, and the Cross Street Church is again celebrating its bicentennial next year, but is now a mile away on West Street. And in terms of the significance and development of the Cross Street Church, again, was founded in 1823, so it'll be 200 years old next year. The Cross Street AME Zion Church was only the fourth free Black church created in Connecticut. So to put this in context, in 1819, you had the development of the very first free Black church in Connecticut. What is now 1818 was the Warwick AME Zion Church in New Haven. So 1818, free African Americans in New Haven developed the first AME Zion Church, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in New Haven. A year after that, in 1819, was the first the Faith Congregational Church in Hartford. 1820, the Dixville Avenue Congregational Church in New Haven. And then fourth, the Cross Street AME Zion Church was founded 1823. And all of those churches I mentioned, the Warwick Memorial AME Zion Church, Faith Congregational, Dixville Avenue, they are also on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, along with the Cross Street AME Zion Church. So when we think about this, by the late 1810s, early 1820s, you have the very first free independent Black churches forming in Connecticut. And really, this is a sign of the development of a free Black community in Connecticut and in New England more broadly. So I mentioned that slavery was practiced in Connecticut from the 1600s until the early 1800s. So in 1784, Connecticut passed what was called the Gradual Emancipation Act. And what the law of 1784 said, it didn't actually free anybody. It said that if you were born after 1784 in Connecticut, you would be free upon reaching 25 years. And if you were already alive in 1784, you would remain enslaved. So really, when we think about the end of slavery, there was no equivalent of an Emancipation Proclamation in the North like there was in the South in 1863. Emancipation here was really a decades-long, generations-long process. So by the 1810s and 20s, was the first time when you had an almost entirely free Black community that had the means to establish independent Black churches in Connecticut, as they had begun to do in larger cities like New York and Philadelphia in the 1790s. So we'll get to the Beeman part of the Beman Triangle. So the Cross Street AME Zion Church is created 1823. By 1830, they get their first permanent pastor, Reverend Jehiel Beman. And Jehiel Beman was the father. His son Leverett is the one who divided up the plots of land and created what we now call the Beman Triangle in the mid-1840s. Reverend Jehiel Beman, as a lot of you probably know, he was born in Colchester, Connecticut in 1789, and he actually was educated in what was called the African School in Colchester. Despite the small size of Colchester's free Black population, they did manage to create their own free Black school by the 1790s, and that school building was recently reconstructed and is also on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. So Jehiel Beman was born in Colchester, 1789. His father, Caesar Beman, and his mother, Sarah Jerry, had been enslaved in Connecticut until the 1780s. And his father, Caesar, actually gained his freedom by fighting in the American Revolution in place of his enslaver, John Isham, and in exchange was given his freedom. And I should just note here that, in fact, hundreds of Black men from Connecticut fought in the American Revolution. Unfortunately, Connecticut didn't actually have a law requiring those who fought to be freed. So we actually have examples of Black men in Connecticut who fought for American independence and then returned to slavery here in Connecticut. One example is Prince Mortimer, who is getting some of the recognition and attention he deserves by researchers such as John Mills and others who are involved with the Connecticut Freedom Trail. But Caesar was one of those who did get his freedom in exchange for fighting. And he actually said that he was able to choose a surname at the time. And he said that he always wanted to, quote, be a man and not a slave. So he chose the name Beeman, to be a man, Beeman. So Jehiel Beman and his family came here in 1830 to head the Cross Street AME Zion Church. I'll move along in terms of the context of slavery here in Middletown. This is actually the Middle Passage Port Marker, it's called. So 4 years ago, the Historical Society and others were involved in dedicating a port marker as part of a global UNESCO United Nations program to mark all the different sites of the transatlantic slave trade globally. Middletown is one of only a couple dozen cities in the US that officially acknowledges and marks the site where hundreds of enslaved people disembarked from Africa right here in Middletown. And we don't know where Caesar Beman would have arrived or where Sarah Jerry would have arrived, but there's a very good chance that Jehiel Beman's parents could have been among the hundreds who landed in Middletown and were subsequently sold to different enslavers here in Connecticut. For an example, this now pretty infamous map of Middletown's Main Street from the 1770s shows that there were actually two, quote, slave dealers or right here on Main Street in Middletown among all the other businesses, because Middletown and the Port of Middletown was actually one of the 5 largest ports in New England and the largest city in Connecticut because of this triangle trade in the transatlantic slave trade between Africa, the West Indies, and North America, especially, and including New England. So get back to the 1820s when the Cross Street AME Zion Church was forming. One thing to keep in mind is, again, the Cross Street AME Zion Church is formed as just the second African Methodist church in Connecticut in 1823. Now it's 1829. One of the first abolitionist texts, one of the first anti-slavery texts, is published by a man named David Walker. And one reason why David Walker's appeal is so significant is traditionally, or unfortunately, a lot of people have associated white abolitionists with the founding of the anti-slavery movement in the North. We're now recognizing that Black leaders themselves, particularly those like David Walker and those like the Beemans, were really at the forefront of the movement to abolish slavery. Again, by the 1820s, slavery in the North was almost entirely abolished, not completely, but in more than 95% of cases, African Americans in the North were free. So now this newly free, organized Black community joined through networks of churches like Cross Street could mobilize to fight slavery in the South, where 90% of African Americans remained enslaved. So David Walker's appeal was one of these early texts where David Walker basically said that if enslavers don't abolish slavery, God will destroy America. He was basically saying that God won't stand for this, and the enslaved have to rise up at all costs, which in the context of slavery is very logical. This pamphlet was so scary that to enslavers that a lot of states, such as South Carolina, actually banned its importation. It became a crime to import this pamphlet from northern states to South Carolina, and Black sailors, for example, who tried to import it were jailed in South Carolina and other southern port cities. But here in Middletown, the Beemans, like other free Black people, were reading these early abolitionist texts, and Amos Beeman, who was Jehiel and Fanny Beeman's son, who himself went on to be a nationally significant abolitionist, later wrote about this, and he wrote, quote, "It was in Middletown that I saw the first number of The Liberator, and its clarion voice sank deep into my mind. That paper and David Walker's appeal were read and reread until their words were stamped in letters of fire upon our soul," which I think is just an amazing phrase. They're read until their words were stamped in letters of fire upon our soul. So he's completely fired up by David Walker's appeal, by The Liberator. So 1831, not 8 years after the Cross Street Church is developed, and 3 years after the Jeffreys start buying property on what is now the Beman Triangle, William Lloyd Garrison, who was a white abolitionist from Boston, founded The Liberator. And The Liberator really was revolutionary in the sense that it called for immediate abolition, saying slavery is always a sin. Slavery must end immediately. There's no exception. There is no excuse. And the abolitionist movement will do all it can to end slavery immediately, which might sound like common sense in the 21st century. But at the time, most people in America were pro-slavery, or if they were against slavery, such as the Colonization Society, they thought that slavery should be abolished gradually, that enslavers should be paid to free enslaved people, that they had a right to be paid for their enslaved, quote, property. It was very revolutionary to say that the enslaved should be freed immediately and without, quote, compensation to the enslaver. And I think this is really significant in terms of, the conversation now is about reparations for the descendants of enslaved, right? In the 1830s, it was the exact opposite. The conversation was really about, we can't end slavery because what about reparations for the enslavers who would lose what's now worth billions of dollars in enslaved property, right? So that was where the conversation was in 1831. I think it's pretty amazing. By 1831, within a few months of The Liberator, the Cross Street Church was having meetings right there on Cross Street, across street from the Beman Triangle, to discuss The Liberator and to discuss the abolitionist movement that was emerging. And there's a quote in The Liberator from the Cross Street Church, and they were debating, colonization movement versus the abolitionist movement, and do we support The Liberator? And they voted as a congregation to support The Liberator, to support the abolitionist movement. And Amos Beeman said famously, quote, in terms of the colonization movement, which wanted to deport free Black people to Liberia, to a British colony in West Africa, quote, "Why should we leave this land so dearly bought by the blood, groans, and tears of our fathers? Truly, this is our home. Here let us live, and here let us die." And this idea of truly this is our home, meaning Connecticut, when he said that this land was bought by the blood, groans, and tears of our fathers, he was literally speaking about his grandfather, Caesar, who fought in the American Revolution for American independence. So again, on the one hand, you had the colonization movement, which was considered progressive and liberal by the mainstream in 1830, which was calling for free Black people to self-deport to Liberia, and for slavery to end gradually and voluntarily. And on the other hand, you have free Black activists like the Beemans, who are saying what we would consider common sense, right? That they've been in America for generations. Their fathers and grandfathers fought in the American Revolution, They built America with unpaid labor for centuries while enslaved. Why wouldn't they stay here and fight for the equality and the citizenship and the equal rights that they deserved? Which, again, would sound like common sense, but this was a radical and uphill battle in the 1830s for the Beemans and for other free Black activists. As I said, pretty quickly after 1831, leaders in the Cross Street Church, like free Black communities throughout New England, were forming this dense network of anti-slavery societies and societies for equality and what they called moral reform or uplift. So in a nutshell, the discourse in New England at the time was the idea that what is the nature of race? What is the nature of people of African descent? And by the 1830s and 40s, you started getting this really entrenched white supremacy based on the myth of racial inferiority and racial superiority. And to counter this, activists like the Beemans were saying, okay, we don't have as much property as white people. We don't have as much wealth. Some Black people do drink, but they were saying that, you know, we've been enslaved until just a decade or two ago. It's essentially slavery that created these conditions that we're fighting against. So temperance, for example, the movement to ban alcohol was very important to free Black people like the Beemans, because temperance, they saw, was the first step in proving that they weren't degraded, they weren't inferior, they were capable of self-government, of governing their churches, all the things that the emerging racial ideology of the time said they weren't capable of. So in 1831, the Beemans and other free Black people formed one of the first Black temperance societies right here in the Cross Street Church in 1833. And that soon became a statewide organization throughout Connecticut. Here's a newspaper article from 1834 when Nancy Beeman, Reverend Jehiel Beeman's second wife, and daughter-in-law Clarissa Beeman helped found what was called the Colored Female Anti-Slavery Society right in the Cross Street Church, which was one of the first three free Black women's abolitionist societies to end Southern slavery that formed in the North in 1834. And again, I just want to get back to the idea of colonization, how the colonization movement had mainstream support from most white New Englanders, not abolition. Abolition in the 1830s was really seen as radical and dangerous, and even white abolitionists in Middletown and throughout New England were being physically attacked. So Black abolitionists faced even more danger. Black churches such as the AME Church in Hartford was actually burned by arsonists in the 1830s. Providence, Rhode Island's Black neighborhood was almost completely leveled by white mobs in the 1830s. So it wasn't just, you know, it was very brave just to publicly assert your equality as free Black people during this period. So this is an early engraving of Wesleyan University, which was founded in 1831, just really just across Foss Hill from the Beman Triangle. They were not connected. It's not like Wesleyan initially on the property. They happened to form next to each other, the Beman Triangle and Wesleyan. But during this early period, because of Wesleyan's 21st century reputation as being progressive, people might assume that Wesleyan was always abolitionist, and that's not the case at all. This address here on the right, this was actually a speech given by Wilbur Fisk, the first president of Wesleyan, who was also the president of the Connecticut Colonization Society. So the administration, the leadership of Wesleyan, like the leadership of New England society more broadly, was very much anti-abolition and pro-colonization during this period. The next point I want to make is really about the civic status, or the political and legal status of free Black people in pre-Civil War Connecticut in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. So this is the 1818 Connecticut Constitution that the Beemans were living under. And I know the writing's small, but in 1818, the Connecticut legislature passed a law explicitly saying only white men could qualify to vote. So beginning in 1818, the state constitution codified the idea that only white men could vote, and this remained in place up until 1870, when Congress passed the 15th Amendment. So for over half a century, free Black men, including the Beemans, were disenfranchised by the state constitution, regardless of how much property they owned, regardless of how educated they were, and they did not, in fact, get the vote until 1870, when those who had been liberated in the South during the Civil War also got the vote, which unfortunately, as we know, Jim Crow soon nullified. But for a couple decades, you also had freed people in the South voting in large numbers. So one point I want to make about the Freedom Trail is, because all free Black people in Connecticut were living under this same state constitution, which said none of them could vote, in a lot of ways, that was another factor that organized Connecticut's free Black community. So many things created networks among free Black people in Connecticut, as represented by all the different sites on the Connecticut Freedom Trail. But I would say that this law was one of those unifying factors that they were organizing against, right? And I would say the one kind of flashpoint was in 1847, when it actually came up for a referendum whether free Black men could vote in Connecticut. And as you'll see here, nearly 4-1, the white male voters of Connecticut, who were the only ones who could vote at the time, voted no, that Black men in Connecticut should not be granted the vote. One thing I think is really inspiring and instructive here is that 1847 referendum, they lost at the polls nearly 4-1 in terms of whether they could vote. 2 years later, in response to this, instead of giving up or saying that, well, the referendum failed, this is the end of the story, they actually formed the first Connecticut state convention of, quote, colored men. So to give a little context, some of you might already know about the, quote, colored convention movement, but these were really remarkable. From 1830, when the first one was held, until the 1890s, there were dozens and dozens of these conventions in every northern state, from Massachusetts west to Illinois, and even California after California statehood, and national ones as well. And what this meant was that even though free Black men in Connecticut couldn't legally vote and were therefore denied the most fundamental aspects of citizenship, they created their own political conventions. They were absolute political actors who met to debate, to vote on resolutions, to organize petition drives for the vote. So in a lot of ways, I see these conventions as Black congresses, that there were that basically they created their own congresses when they were excluded from the all-white congresses that had official political and legal power in this country. So 1849, you had the first, quote, colored convention in Connecticut. The Beemans were the leaders of this. But one thing that I think is fascinating about these conventions is that they had delegates. Almost every Black community in Connecticut sent delegates to represent them at these conventions. So you'll see right here that Hartford, Middletown, New Haven, Bridgeport, all of those free Black communities and neighborhoods I mentioned, the churches in Hartford and New Haven, Jail Hill in Norwich, Little Liberia in Bridgeport, those free Black communities were really knit together by movements like the convention, because they would send delegates to these conventions, and then they would form networks among these communities. So I think going forward, when we think about how the Connecticut Freedom Trail is interconnected, how these 130 plus sites are interconnected, the convention movement is central to that story, at least in the 19th century, central to the story of how disparate free Black communities throughout Connecticut truly created a statewide network against slavery and for equality. And Amos Beeman, who, as I mentioned, was Jehiel and Fanny Beeman's son, was a leader of the church in New Haven, a leader of the convention movement, and also became a national leader in the convention movement and in the anti-slavery movement. Moving forward, the last point I wanted to say is, in addition to churches and the convention movement and abolition societies, the Underground Railroad really linked many of the different sites on the Connecticut Freedom Trail, and linked many of the different free Black activists throughout the state. One thing that is very significant about the Underground Railroad is we really should not think of the Underground Railroad as separate from the history of Black churches or separate from the history of sort of above ground, visible Black political activism, that a lot of the same free Black leaders who were leading the churches and were leading the convention movement were also agents on the Underground Railroad in private, in secret. In secret because obviously it was illegal under federal law. The Underground Railroad was illegal under federal law. So we see that, for instance, Henry Foster, who was a leader of the Black Convention movement from Hartford, we see him aiding Reverend James Smith to escape to New England. And Reverend Smith documents this in his narrative when he lived in Norwich's Jail Hill neighborhood. So there was this whole largely hidden network of free Black activists who weren't just advocating for the end of slavery, but then when those from the South managed to escape to New England, provided them immediate aid at the risk of their own freedom, at the risk of being jailed themselves. I mentioned the colored convention was in 1849. A year later, Congress passed the infamous 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And you've probably heard of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Essentially, the Constitution said that those who escaped slavery had to be returned. So the US Constitution was really the first, quote, Fugitive Slave Act that existed. And this was followed up in 1793 by a federal Fugitive Slave Act. But the 1851 went much further. It said that in the North, you were legally required to help recapture those who were escaping. So it basically turned everyone in the North into, quote, slave catchers, to use the terminology of the time. And this was one of the immediate causes of the Civil War, because you had a lot of white Northerners who weren't necessarily going to fight slavery in the South, but they also didn't want to be told that they had to aid in capturing those who had escaped, right? And for the free Black community, this completely mobilized activism among free Black communities, because this was an existential threat to free Black communities like the Beman Triangle. In the Beman Triangle, by 1850, even though most people there had been born in New England, you had a handful of Southern-born people who were most likely had escaped from slavery and therefore were legally liable to be returned to slavery under this law. So we had what I have on the screen here is actually a letter that Jehiel Beman wrote to Frederick Douglass in 1854. And Frederick Douglass was a close associate with the Beamans. He came to Middletown at least 3 times to speak in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1870s. And he basically is openly saying the Underground Railroad is operating in Middletown. He said, "I would inform you we had a recent arrival from the land of whips and chains, where the image of the divine being is bought and sold. But thank the good Lord, we at once recognized him as a man and brother." So he's saying, you know, this the land of whips and chains, the South. We had a recent arrival who escaped from the South and arrived at Freedom Church, at Cross Street Church. And I think, you know, one reason why he did this, why he openly put this in the newspaper, was that the Fugitive Slave Act was so outrageous and so catalyzing and mobilizing that you did have free Black communities openly defying it. In this case, openly defying it in print, and giving us one of our best pieces of evidence of how involved the Middletown's free Black community was in the Underground Railroad. The final point I want to make is the Civil War, which was really in a lot of ways the ultimate battle for freedom, the ultimate battle against slavery, also knit together Connecticut's free Black communities. So on the left here is a photo of Connecticut's 29th Regiment. Initially, the federal government did not allow free Black people to enlist in the military during the Civil War, even though many wanted to enlist to end slavery. Some still had friends and family behind in the South who were still enslaved. But because of the racial ideology of the time, the racist ideology of the time, there was a big debate about whether Black men were capable of being soldiers. That changed by 1863, by the middle of the war, both because of the activism of men like Frederick Douglass, who were promoting enlistment, as well as the need of the Union Army to have more soldiers. So anyway, by 1863, you had enlistment by free Black men, and fully 1/10 of all Civil War soldiers, about 200,000 men, were African American. So when you think about who was a Civil War soldier, proportionally, African American men fought even above their proportion in the population. And this is a photo of Amster Dingle, who was one of the more than a dozen African American soldiers from Middletown, including the Beman Triangle. And on the Connecticut Freedom Trail is actually a monument, a memorial to the 29th Connecticut, which was one of the 3 Black regiments, and that is in New Haven. So just trying to give you an example of how the Freedom Trail and its sites tell these stories and link them all together. Civil War ends in 1865. Finally, in 1865, Congress passes the 13th Amendment, which ends slavery in the South. And yet, even after 1865, even after the North had fought the Civil War, supposedly, as people now think, to end slavery, which is more complicated than that, again in 1865, white voters in Connecticut voted down a referendum to grant the vote to Black men in Connecticut. So if you think about how entrenched racism was in Connecticut, they had just fought the Civil War against the slaveholding South, and yet still refused to extend the vote to free Black men here in Connecticut. Finally, in 1870, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, as I mentioned, and that is when in 1870, African Americans in Connecticut, African American men, I should specify, were enfranchised along with recently freed people in the South. So that's sort of the story, the very brief 45-minute version of the Beman Triangle and its history. After 1870, you have a new chapter in Connecticut's Black history. You have African American voting. So then you have the political parties and voting drives and political organizations become key instead of the conventions you saw in the pre-Civil War period. Here in Middletown, even though the 15th Amendment granted the vote to free Black men, unfortunately, by the late 1800s, you had a lot of economic setbacks for free Black communities. So a lot of the maritime trade, the river trade, the transatlantic trade that had provided jobs for many free Black men in New England were going away, were being replaced by industry, and factories that were emerging almost exclusively hired white men, not Black men. So by the early 20th century, you see free Black people in Connecticut being almost completely shut out of the new industrial economy. And for this reason, by the early 20th century, a lot of the free Black families in Middletown moved to larger cities. And by the 1920s, the Beman Triangle became, as I said, an almost totally white working class neighborhood. If there's any ray of hope in that story, well, there's 2 rays of hope in that story. One is that, as many of you know, the descendants of these families, the Wormsleys, the Garrisons, the Smiths, have been in New England for, in some cases, 300 years and are still here and are still thriving. So the descendants of those early free Black communities are still in New England, A. And B, by the 1920s, you get the Great Migration and a new wave from the South of African Americans coming and rejuvenating and replenishing congregations like the Cross Street Church with new members, new leadership, and a new thriving Black community that was much larger than the one that had been here before the Civil War. And their descendants now far outnumber those who had been here before the Civil War. So I want to leave, we only have 10 minutes left. I'll pause here and take questions. I'd love to have questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
John, thank you so very much. John, I'm sorry. When you said John Mills, I meant Jesse Nasta. Thank you so very much for this presentation and for tying the Beman Triangle to the Connecticut Freedom Trail, which now has over 161 sites and growing. So thank you very much for that. We do have a few questions. The first question is from Janine. They would like to know how many of the families in the neighborhood were indigenous or of mixed race with indigenous and African descent?
Good. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. So the short answer is that I would guess at least half, a rough estimate of, if I think about the first 10 families in the Beman Triangle, I would say about half of them were of mixed African and indigenous descent. The Jeffreys, for example, were part Mohican. The Fanny Beman, Jahalbian's first wife, had some Pequot ancestry. So I think, and just for context, in the 1600s, both Native Americans and African Americans were enslaved in Connecticut, as elsewhere in New England. So their descendants often intermarried and shared the same legal status as either indentured or enslaved. So really, you see those families creating sort of they call themselves, people of color, or, quote, the colored church. They sort of created like a pan person of color identity in some cases, where you had people of mixed African and Native American ancestry founding AME Zion churches together, for instance, without drawing a real sharp distinction between who's 100% African American and who's part, African American.
Right. Thank you. Another question comes from John. He joined us a little late. He wanted to know if you could talk about the origin of the name of the Beeman.
Right. So I mentioned really briefly that Caesar Beeman, when he was legally freed in 1781 for fighting in the Revolution, like other enslaved people, taking on a last name of one's own was a mark of freedom, right? That you didn't have to go by your enslaver's last name. So he always said, I quote, wanted to be a man and not a slave. So he took the name Beeman to be a man. And Jehiel Beeman told that story in print. So we're getting it pretty direct from the source. It was Jehiel told that directly in print. So I tend to believe it. Yeah.
Awesome.
And also think of how common the name, for example, Freeman is, and that's, a free man. So whether it's, to be Beeman, to be a man, or the very common surname of Freeman, a free man, they all express that same will to be free.
Exactly. We do have another question. Judy, she says she went to school in West Hartford in the 60s, and there was no mention of slavery in Connecticut. Is this now taught in part of the history classes today?
I would say most schools, a lot of schools do mention slavery. One thing I will say is probably 3 years ago now, the state legislature did mandate a course in African American and Latinx history be taught in Connecticut. I think that's wonderful. The only critique is that it's still an elective. So you could elect not to take African American history. I think it should be a requirement for all students, because some of the people who would learn the most about African American history might elect not to take it, which is unfortunate. And I see another one from John, right, was allowing African American men in the Union Army solely about whether or not they're capable, whether economic or broader socioeconomic reasons. Yeah, I mean, it was a combination. It was really, it was largely about winning the war. Now, for free Black people, it was about equality, right? It was about proving one's citizenship, proving one's manhood, proving one's ability. So for free Black communities, it was very much political and about equality. But for military leaders, it was primarily about winning the war. And in the South, you actually had a lot of enslaved people escaping and going to the army line. So then you had these generals saying, "Well, wait, do we have them fight as soldiers, or do we return them to Confederates who are going to try to enlist the enslaved people to fight the Union?" So it became a military strategy for a lot of military leaders.
Awesome. There is another question. Are there any descendants of the Beemans or Jeffreys that we know of currently in Connecticut or in New England?
That's a good question. I know that the Condos and Jeffreys. I don't know if you're familiar with Vicki Welch. Vicki Welch is a genealogist who wrote a genealogy of the Condell family, Beemans. So if you look up Vicki Welch's book, it's called "And They Were Related To." It tracks the Condell and Jeffrey families down. So I know some of them were in Meriden as recently as 20 years ago. Some descendants of the Condells. I'm on the trail of a Beeman descendant in California. So it's sort of, the research is sort of endless, because I spend so much time tracking down people who lived 2 centuries ago, but then there's just as much effort and time to be spent in connecting with living descendants. So it's sort of like, it's a never-ending project.
Yep, the life of a researcher. You go down one rabbit hole after the other. It's endless. Well, Jesse, we don't have any more questions. We have a few more moments. If you wish to put another question into our chat box, please feel free. But in the meantime, I'll remind you of our survey to please let us know how we're doing. And if there are any particular subjects you would like to hear, and we'll do our best to get speakers on to address those. Let's see, do we have information on the time some of the Beman men spent in the Army and if they saw any action?
Mhm. I know that Charles Beman, so Amy's son Charles, did fight and did see action in the military. So I know of one Beman who did, yes. And then from Tom, have you made any connections to the Jeffries, Collins, and others who lived in North Lyme that were documented and they were related to? Again, Vicki Welch did make contact with them and interviewed them for her book, and they were related too. So in a lot of ways, she did a lot of that work of interviewing and gathering photos, but I should reach out as well.
Awesome. Well, there are no more questions. We are almost out of time. I would like to thank you so very much.
Oh,
Hold on. We got one more. What is planned for the AME Zion 200th anniversary?
So I know the church is forming their own bicentennial committee. I reached out to them and said that I'm here to participate if they want, but really it's, the church is leading the way on that.
Okay. Thank you. Let's give it like 20 more seconds before every time I get ready to end, another one pops up. Let's see if another one pops up. But in the meantime, I'll remind our audience that every fourth Tuesday, we do have a conversation at noon. We hope that you'll come back and join us. Next month, October 25th, it is Discovering the Legacy of James L. Smith. He was a freedom seeker who made his way here to Connecticut. A fascinating story. I hope you'll join us October 25th at noon on that Tuesday. And then in November 22nd, we have the Witness Stone Project, telling the stories of the enslaved across Connecticut. So if you've ever heard of the Witness Stone, but not really sure exactly what that project is about, please join us, and you will hear more about it, and you will also be able to ask those same questions that others are asking as well. Again, Jesse, thank you so very much for being with us today. It was such a pleasure. And again, thank you for tying in the Freedom Trail with the Beeman Leverett Triangle in Middletown. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. Thank you. And we should mention that October 8th, a week from this Saturday, you will be one of the presenters in Middletown when we have our Amistad Day at Harbor Park in Middletown. So people should keep an eye out for that as well.
Yes, please do. Hopefully you'll come out and join us. I will bring to life Sarah Margul, who was one of the children aboard the Amistad. She will tell you her story from the beginning, not just when she was enslaved here in Connecticut, but what her family life was like, as well as that journey through the Middle Passage. So thank you for bringing that up, Jesse. I appreciate that. And all of you in the audience, thank you so very much for joining us again. Until the next time.